And so I came across a study by the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health. This is the federal government group of scientists that looks into mortality rates of various occupations. And they look at, if there are minors or if there are people in, occupations that are dangerous, they look in and do studies and see just how dangerous they are. The NFL Players Association believed this hype that the players were dying young, so they commissioned the survey. And this survey looked at, it's not even a survey, it looked at every single player who played the National Football League for, I think, 4 seasons or more, or 5 seasons or more, from 1959 to, I think, the early 1990s. And what they found, they looked at about 20 different categories, and it turned out that the NFL players in almost every single category did better than the average Joes.
I'm really happy to hear the statistics on this, the actual data, because this has been one of those issues that we commonly don't take from a rational standpoint. We don't address it according to, okay, what are the numbers? What does the science tell us? Whatever. It's all about feeling. It's all about emotions. And so when you have someone, a great, popular, beloved player like Junior Seau, who meets a tragic end, we identify with that, but we don't know, is that an outlier or is this common? You know what I mean? So then it just becomes this whole trope that you can't get away from. You can't cite statistics and speak in a rational, objective way about it, because people are going to say, oh, you're just trying to cover up the problem.
I'm honored today on pre-Super Bowl Friday to have 2 eminent minds and analysts and interesting men, Daniel J. Flynn, if I'm not mistaken, and Jerry Thornton. Daniel writes for the American Spectator and has a book out which I have had prominently shelved in my house, The War on Football. It stays in and out of focus. When you read it, it actually is in focus, and it's going to be the focus of our talk today. And I have the preeminent, comedy sports writer, Jerry Thornton, on. He writes for Barstool, and he's been prominent on the Boston scene. And Dan is in the area as well, so maybe we'll get together for a beer afterwards. Given that the pandemic seems to have subsided, perhaps except in certain people's minds. Anyway, so the war on football and football in general. So I'll go maybe alphabetically. Dan, what prompted you to write this book, and what is the war on football, and who's winning?
Well, I wrote it. It's almost 15 years ago that I wrote it. And the reason why I wrote it is I wrote an article for the American Spectator because for years I had been hearing from Malcolm Gladwell and George Will and all these people that football and particularly NFL players were dying young. And so I came across a study by the National Institutes of Occupational Safety and Health. This is the federal government group of scientists that looks into mortality rates of various occupations. And they look at, if there are minors or if there are people in, occupations that are dangerous, they look in and do studies and see just how dangerous they are. The NFL Players Association believed this hype that the players were dying young, so they commissioned the survey. And this survey looked at, it's not even a survey, it looked at every single player who played the National Football League for, I think, 4 seasons or more, or 5 seasons or more, from 1959 to, I think, the early 1990s. And what they found, they looked at about 20 different categories, and it turned out that the NFL players in almost every single category did better than the average Joes. Even something like suicide. They were expecting to find 22 suicides amongst those players, and there were 9 suicides. So it's a 59% decrease in what the mortality rate would be on suicide for the guys watching in the stands. So there were literally hundreds of players who had lived longer, presumably because of football or maybe some other reason. But the bottom line is that football players, at least ones that tend to play a long time, tended to live longer than people watching the game. And it kind of makes sense. When I talked to several of the scientists that were involved in the study, the lead author and several others. And what they said is, look, this is like a Superman cohort. These are guys out there running and jumping and lifting weights. They also have the access to the best medical care. So the whole idea that they were dying young, which was widespread story in the media that you would find in very mainstream places. It didn't matter if the writer was a liberal or a conservative. It was a very widespread belief that NFL players died young. And in fact, they were outliving their peers. And so once I wrote that, I was approached to write the book. And I said, well, gee, get some football player to write it. Get some guy in the NFL, get a coach to write it. But no one bit. And so I thought, well, geez, if no one's doing it, I'll write it.
Well, thank you for that. I found it a really fascinating read. You go back to the Teddy Roosevelt era, and it's kind of a little bit of a rehash of that. But I don't know if you want to just give us a kind of historical arc, and before we let Jerry kind of chime in.
Well, I mean, in the 1905 season, there were, on one particular Saturday, there were as many players who died from collisions than died this entire past season. So it was a more dangerous game. Not everyone was, wearing a helmet. And until very recently before that, there was something known as the football player haircut. We all know what a hockey player haircut is, but the football player haircut, not that different from what Pat Mahomes has today, which is a lot of hair up front, a lot more hair than I have. Almost like your hair was going to act like a helmet, as if that was sort of more safe. I don't know. So the safety wasn't a big deal back then. But I think the best way to look at it is that football, baseball is a static game, pastoral, bucolic game. It's a game where if you were to take any baseball player today, if you were to take Ohtani or whoever and transport him back in time to the 1890s, they would play the game and they would have no problem. They would have no problem playing the game because it's basically the same game. There hasn't been much change as far as rules or anything else with regard to baseball. Football's different. Football is a game. It's a revolutionary game of violence and change. And because you have so much violence, you get change. So after that 1905 season, they did away with certain things. They created a neutral zone. So, we didn't have a neutral zone prior to that season. They got rid of forward motion. You still see that, vestiges of that in the Canadian Football League, where offensive players get to run towards the line of scrimmage, get a full speed ahead before the ball is snapped. In American football, they did away with that after that season. And the biggest development was the forward pass. And they thought all these things were going to make the game safer. Well, they did to some degree. But obviously, over the years, you see much more developments as far as fitness, but mainly rules, changes of rules, and equipment. And on those last two, I mean, we've seen the development of these Guardian helmets. They look kind of like that guy Kazoo that was on the Flintstones way back on that cartoon. He's big-headed guys. You also have the kickoff change. I mean, I don't really like that rule change, and I'm not. The jury's still out whether that's making the game safer. However, this last year, there were 182 concussions in the NFL, and the 9 or 10 seasons that they've been doing statistics on that, that's a stat like sacks or touchdowns now, concussions. So there was 182 concussions this past season. That's a drop of 17% from last season. It's the fewest number of concussions in the history since they've been looking at this in the NFL. So it seems to be getting safer, and I think later on in the discussion we can flesh that out to other leagues as well. But you have from that 1905 season, you had all sorts of changes. But really, since then, there's been all sorts of changes. And we can get into it. But with regard to helmets, with regard to where the goalpost was situated on the field, all sorts of things changed to make the game safer.
So, Jerry, you have followed football pretty closely. What are your kind of general thoughts about the correlation, without having delved, quite so deeply as Daniel Flynn, in the topic, and how do these kind of claims correlate with perhaps other issues that players might have, maybe using as kind of a fig leaf or cover for some kind of behavioral issues that might otherwise be there anyway, given that it might be somewhat violent type of individuals that go out into a career in football anyway. I don't know if you have any.
First of all, it's an honor to meet Dan Flynn. It's always a pleasure to meet someone who's a part of a community in America that has been underappreciated and underserved, and that is our noble and brave football book author community. So, if we could please making a plea to the Trump administration to please take some of those USAID funds and funnel them towards the great men and women who produce football books. So thank you. I'll take $1 million right now if you're giving it out. I'm really happy to hear the statistics on this, the actual data, because this has been one of those issues that we commonly don't take from a rational standpoint. We don't address it according to, okay, what are the numbers? What does the science tell us? Whatever. It's all about feeling. It's all about emotions. And so when you have someone, a great, popular, beloved player like Junior Seau, who meets a tragic end, we identify with that, but we don't know, is that an outlier or is this common? You know what I mean? So then it just becomes this whole trope that you can't get away from. You can't cite statistics and speak in a rational, objective way about it, because people are going to say, oh, you're just trying to cover up the problem. But what Flynn is talking about is exactly the kind of thing that we should be looking at this from, not just anecdotal nonsense, but what are the numbers? And, when we talk about making the game more safe, and okay, the kickoff rule is an attempt to do that, and, having them wear those big mushroom covers on their helmets during, if you play certain positions, during certain weeks of training camp, okay, maybe it's just window dressing. Maybe it's nothing. Whatever, it's an attempt. I am old enough to remember watching the last major league player go to the plate without a batting helmet on. He was Carlton Fisk's backup catcher with the Red Sox, a guy named Bob Montgomery, and he just wore a cap. And they used to say, well, he's got a little plastic shield underneath his helmet. Okay, but he's leaning over the plate with Nolan Ryan on the mound. Like, what are we doing? But you go back, I don't know, 70 years. The idea of wearing a protective helmet on your skull was unheard of. I mean, Lou Gehrig, they are pretty convinced now, died of Lou Gehrig's disease, but he contracted it from repeated blows to the head. I think he was knocked unconscious something like 8 times in his career with fastballs. So, an attempt to make the sport safer is fine. I'm all for them, but it was just a few years ago they were trying to get the sport outlawed on all levels. And as Dan pointed out as well, one of my favorite historical figure, Teddy Roosevelt, saved the sport while the major colleges were trying to get rid of it. Because I think in 1905, weren't there like 18 players across the country who were killed playing football? Well, rather than just go, we can't do this anymore, they applied logic. Let's adapt the game to the current situation. And they saved it because he understood, as I do, that football is good for America. It's good for kids. It's good for adults. It's a positive.
No, I agree with that. I consulted the CDC, and occasionally they might be reliable. Who knows? But I actually had a startup, not really a startup, but kind of it was a small little, I guess it was a little startup. We had a bunch of people we came up with a device called the No Brainer. At the time, this concussion stuff was out, and we were going to have a sensor device that would measure the impact and kind of correlate with concussions and so forth. And I started researching some of the stuff. That's kind of how I came across Dan's book on the war on football. But what we see here is from the CDC. This is the traumatic brain injury rates by sport. And this chart was, I had ChatGPT do, but the actual chart, I can show later from the CDC. It's this, and so this is a little bit harder to read. And I don't know, I have no idea why bowling is the top one. So leaving that aside, we have horseback riding, ice skating, golf, and I actually have been hit in the head by somebody else, by an errant golf ball, and once by my own, having hit into a tree and back at me. So I imagine this all-terrain vehicle riding, tobogganing, hockey, dirt bike, bicycling, amusement attractions, baseball. I guess the pre-helmet, who knows? Go-kart, soccer. At any rate, here's football right here in the middle. So this is kind of average, kind of traumatic brain injury rates by sport when looking at the totality. I'm not going to go over the CDC's actual data, but it's not necessarily the highest rated of any of these. So there's the great philosopher Willie Sutton, whom I quote. Why did you rob banks? It's like, well, that's where the money is. People are not going after big horseback riding or big sledding, big tobogganing. They're not going after big, fill in the blank. They're not even going after the NHL, which, has some money. I mean, they picked football. I want to, ask whether Mr. Flynn or Professor Flynn, how would you like to go by, discuss this a little bit? Doctor, sir, you name it. Okay.
Well, on your point, back when there were a lot of lawsuits going around, I mean, one of the lawsuits was against the NFL, guys that were suing because they said they got, traumatic brain injuries, or they got lifelong brain issues because of football. About 10% of those guys that had sued the league never played a down in the NFL. I mean, they'd played a lot of downs in college football. They'd played a lot of downs in high school and maybe in youth leagues. But they had a cup of coffee in the NFL as part of a taxi squad or as part of a preseason, those 90-man rosters in preseason, they get whittled down to 53. And so about 10% of those guys suing the league had never played an actual down in a regular season NFL game or playoff game. Similar situation was going on with regard to the suit against Riddell helmets. At that time, I believe they were maybe the official sponsor or something like that of the league. I mean, players could have worn any helmet they wanted to, but Riddell had an official association at that time with the league. And there were guys like, you look at a guy like Eric Dickerson. He was suing Riddell. You saw him on the cover of Sports Illustrated wearing a bike helmet. Ken Stabler, he was suing. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated wearing a Wilson helmet. You look at their football cards, Carl Mecklenburg, all these guys were wearing different kind of helmets, but somehow they were all suing Riddell because that was what was in fashion at the time. And so I think all that goes to show that there's, there was something of a money grab going on. I'm not going to deny that a guy that plays in the league for 15 years or 12 years or something like that, and he's played football before that, maybe there is, he could have sustained damage, but the idea that guys that were punters that played in replacement games in 1987, and then all these guys that never even actually played a down in the league were suffering because of the brief stint they had in the NFL. I just don't buy that. That sort of more gets into the litigious nature of our culture. And it wasn't just that suit against the NFL. I mean, that was the one that was getting the most headlines, but there were all sorts of suits going on at the time. Because I think, as what Jerry was saying, it was kind of one of these fashions where anecdotes really get into the press. I mean, when I was a kid, there was a big mania about the killer bees. The killer bees were all going to come to get us, and people were afraid about that. Nowadays, in the summer, it's always stories about sharks getting people when, the incidence of that is quite low. But when you actually look at the data behind the headlines, you kind of see that the whole thing is blown up. I mean, there was at one point in, I think, 2015 or 2016, where I wrote an article about how there were more articles in the New York Times about chronic traumatic encephalopathy than there were documented cases of chronic traumatic encephalopathy. They had more articles in the New York Times on this disease than there were actually documented cases of it in human beings. I think that little item sort of gives you an illustration of how much there was a fixation in the press on this issue, and how much there was just that they really overdid it. It wasn't based on science. It was based on kind of hysteria, kind of a witch hunt type of thing.
Yeah, I'm just going to interject briefly before I turn it over to Jerry. I've had on Wilfred Riley 3 times maybe. He has a book called Hate Crime Hoax, where most of the hate crimes are hoaxes, thus the title. And it's basically the demand for racism doesn't quite meet the supply of racism doesn't quite meet the demand. There's a fair amount of hucksterism and hustlers and whatnot. Another one is that probably 20x years ago, there was a trolley accident near, I don't know, Park Street or something like that, downtown Boston. And, it was middle of the day, wasn't too populated, and they let everybody out of the train, but they didn't take names and so forth. And so when the suit came along for damages, there were like 250 people out of a train car that had maybe like 20 or 30 at the time.
I bet I know half of those people.
Filed suit, and so there is an attractant. It's an attractive nuisance, kind of moral hazard of putting a bag of money in the street, and then hilarity ensues. I actually recently saw, at the advice of an economist friend of mine, it's a mad, 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 mad world, and that's how the movie ends. I'm giving it away, but money falls and people go nuts. This is kind of like part of the thing. I don't know if you have any experiences like that, Jerry. You want to comment on what Dan has already mentioned?
Yeah, I try to approach life with the ability to just kind of pull back a little bit and look for patterns, for pattern recognition, like to notice sometimes things come along that weren't an issue 5 minutes ago and are front and center, and everyone's obsessed with it, and everyone's got an opinion, and things that didn't exist a little while ago, now all of a sudden they're total experts on it. And then a few days go by and you don't hear about it again. I'm old enough to remember the Satanic Panic back in the 80s. Rap music is going to teach kids swear words they otherwise wouldn't know. There's an old Tom Hanks made-for-TV movie I highly recommend. It's called Mazes and Monsters, where he's in a Dungeons and Dragon-like game, and the next thing you know, he's at the top of a skyscraper wanting to throw himself off because he thinks he can fly. Anorexia. When was the last time you heard anyone mention anorexia? Now it's, I don't know, it's grant money coming from the government that no one knew about before, but now everybody's John Kenneth Galbraith, and this CTE thing was one of them, which isn't to say that it's not a threat. I mean, it's not like the Tom Hanks character was just never existed. This is absolutely something that needs to be monitored and addressed. But it was a hysteria for a little while, and it burns hot for a while, and then everyone just moves on. And what's going to happen the second Sunday in February? Everyone in America is going to be watching a football game that a few years ago you were convinced that you were committing like a crime against humanity for feeding into this thing that's slowly killing America's young men. So yeah, look at patterns. Learn to ignore the things that are just a nothing burger, but it's just someone generating hysteria because they're pulling on people's emotions so that you'll sit there at commercials for penis medicines.
Yeah. No, I remember the McMartin case, and I forget the name here. His French name starts with an A, like Arsenal or whatever. The nurseries with the you mentioned satanic rituals. What was it called? It was like Happy Gardens.
They called him Tookie, and he didn't do it.
Oh, yeah.
And when I was a kid, his nickname was synonymous with being a child molester. And the guy didn't molest anyone. And yet here I was as a 10-year-old kid making jokes with my friends. Anytime you wanted to call someone a molester at that time in the 1980s, you'd call someone a Tookie. And he didn't do it. He didn't do it. There was such a hysteria over this guy in Malden.
Yeah, and he never got his "where do I go to get my reputation back" moment.
Yeah.
Everyone just kind of moved on from, well, we were wrong about that. Let's not to dive down a rabbit hole, but for sure COVID was that. Like when everyone's dead wrong about a thing, about a hysteria, they never want to circle back. It's like I've never had this experience myself, but if you win an argument with your spouse, what does the spouse always want to do? Oh, are we still talking about that? Please, let's move on.
Let's move on.
I'm certainly like that about Deflategate. I could talk all day about that. I won't, but
there's a fair number of them.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I was right all along about this. Can we address it? No, we can't. So all the people were saying like football really needs to be banned and you shouldn't sign your children up for it because it's extremely dangerous. None of them ever bothered to look at that bar graph that you put up there. And by the way, bowling. Bowling isn't just number one, it's number one by a lot. May I suggest that if you're getting concussed while bowling, you're
Yeah, is it you hold on to the ball too long, or you fall into the alley? I have no idea.
I think it
is
may
it that
be
it
what you
fly,
do
if it's the
while
big
you're
ball and it
bowling.
flies out of your hand as you're on your backswing and
Maybe
you're
it's getting
hitting
somebody
people?
behind you. Even the small balls, like if you just the kids, they probably toss them and somebody's eating a pizza and boom, like who knows? But the
Or is
question
it
I
a
have,
Fred Flintstone scenario where they don't take their fingers out of the holes and they go sliding into the head pin?
yeah, anything you can almost. I'm pretty active. I play sports and whatnot, but I've been hit like X being a large number a lot of times. And it's like, it's embarrassing to mention some of them, fall down the stairs. My wife, I like to think I'm fairly humorous as things go, but she doesn't really laugh at any of my jokes. But the first day we were at this house that I'm in right now, she had taken all the carpeting out because carpeting bad. And so I go down the stairs, and it's a 1920s-ish house, and I'm, not super tall, but I had to kind of like duck to get whatever that's called, where the, part where this other floor is. So you got to kind of go back. So I went back to avoid hitting my head, and I slid down the stairs, and I landed on my back, like, I don't know, Flintstones or whatever, Homer Simpson or something like that. And she was in hysterics. I could not stop her laughing. I was in horrible pain, and I don't know. That could explain a lot that came after. Maybe I was hugely concussed, and that's why I'm doing this. But the question I have for Dan is kind of the counterfactual aspect. My favorite example, I brought it up last time we spoke about a year ago, is LeBron James. He's so wealthy, and yet nobody's come forward to claim his being a father to LeBron James. Now, there got to be a lot of guys out there who could theoretically be LeBron James' father, and there's so much money there and fame and prestige that you want to announce it to the world. Well, his mom was in such dire straits for X, Y, and Z reasons that she has no idea who it is. Nobody's come forward, and so forth. And she gave him up basically for adoption, and he was adopted at a young age, in the single digits, by a football coach, a man named Walker. Can't remember the first name, and basically his life changed. He had discipline and so forth. So on a counterfactual basis, let's stipulate there are injuries that happen with all these sports. We mentioned, probably, being in a duck boat or whatever. There's risk wherever you go. What would be the counterfactual amongst the cohort that has historically gone into the NFL? Would they be, accountants and travel agents that were keeping them for those prodigious careers, or what?
Well, we don't know. I mean, would they have gone to college? These guys, I don't think for a lot of them they would have, because football is the main attraction. I think if you look at the guys that go into the NFL, I mean, it's on our TV every Sunday, or at least it is in the fall, and so that kind of danger is omnipresent in our mind because it's advertised every week and we see it. I mean, just last year on the ski slopes of Colorado, there were 15 people who died from collisions with trees, with collisions with other skiers, collisions with the ice. That's just in Colorado. That's about as many people that have died playing football the last, 4 or 5 years. And so there's been a dramatic change. The reason we know football's safer is because if you look back, people used to talk about players getting killed. People don't really talk about players getting killed anymore. I mean, because it doesn't happen that often. It's like a 1 in a million thing where someone might get hit, and something bad might happen. Incidentally, it's never happened in the NFL. There was a guy that got hit by a ball in Major League Baseball and died. But nobody's ever gotten killed from a football hit in the NFL. There was one in the AFL, or there was a death. I'm sorry, there was a death in the AFL. But there's never been a death from a football hit in the NFL. Now, if you look back in 1968, that's the peak of football violence. You had, like, depending upon, which data set you look at, it's either 35 or 36 players were killed from collisions in football that year. If you look at the last 10 years, it's the same amount for the last 10 years. In other words, it was 10 times, the amount of football deaths from collisions these last 10 years is the exact same amount that died from collisions in 1968 in that 1 year. So there's been an evolution towards a more safer game for reasons that I gave earlier. I think that the problem, and you bring up the idea of LeBron and what would have happened to these guys. Listen, football is one of the only games where being the class fat kid, you're going to get an advantage. You don't get much of an advantage being a fat kid in soccer or basketball. You could in baseball. But in football, all of a sudden, what was a detriment to you in other sports, you can suddenly be considered athletic. And so you want to, I think the problem we have in society now is we have too many kids on the couch and not enough kids in cleats. I think the obesity rate for kids in 1970, let's say that Jerry was born in 1970. Let's, or Jerry was a kid in 1970, or Randy was a kid. No, I don't know when Randy was born, but in 1970, I think it was about 5%. And now, it's I think over a third or something like that. Football is one of those things in society that can help with that, because you get kids that are not normally engaged and you put them on a football field and all of a sudden something lights up. They also, you mentioned LeBron not having a dad. All of a sudden, for all those kids that don't have a dad, there's an authority figure. And if you've seen football coaches before, boy, are they authority figures. I mean, sometimes they're authority figures you don't want to mess with. That can be a very positive thing in a young person's life, particularly a young kid that doesn't have a father figure in the home. And so I think there's a lot of benefits from football. But to me, the biggest benefit is that on every play on a football field, you'll see many people getting knocked down. They will get knocked down into the dirt. And they have a choice at that point. You can either stay down or you get up. And in that sense, football is a lot like life. Everyone watching this podcast has been knocked down before. Not everyone has got up. But in football, they give you a choice. You can stay down in that muck or you can get up. And I think in that sense, football gives kids a life lesson. There's life lessons in all sports, but that's the life lesson that football gives. And I think it's a profound one. And to take that away from kids, when we talk, the NFL is making record number of money. But if you look at youth leagues, particularly around our state, Massachusetts, they're closing up shop. They are joining with abutting towns and having sort of a multi-town teams. They don't have, if you go to their practices, they don't have enough kids on the teams to start a scrub squad, to practice squad, to have a scrimmage in practice. So there's been dramatic changes in football at the youth level. We don't see it as much because we're watching it. We're distracted with the NFL. But I think that gets the heart of your question, because it's at the youth level that a lot of kids' lives are reoriented for the better in youth football. That's not happening as much now because of this witch hunt over the game that started, 10 years ago or so. Or that was started a little bit earlier than that, but really hit its peak probably 10 or 12 years ago.
Randy, can I jump in here real quick to just kind of echo something that Dan's talking about? You consume as much comedy as I do. You'll often hear something that you hit yourself on the side of the head and go, "Oh, I wish I had thought of that." Adam Carolla, great Adam Carolla, said, he's got a fantastic line, which is, okay, there's certain danger in your kid playing football, but how about the danger of him growing up to be a pussy? That's where I have lived it. Okay, when I was all through middle school, I was the fat kid that Dan is talking about. I went out for the freshman team when I was in 9th grade. Never saw the field. I was too small. I was too chubby, whatever. But it was kind of my Rocky Balboa thing. No matter how hard I get hit, I'm just going to keep getting up. And I lost weight. I went to practice every day. I did the calisthenics. The coach was constantly threatening to take my uniform away because I couldn't protect myself or whatever. But to the day I die, I will never forget the feeling of walking out of his office after the last game to thank him, and him giving me a speech about how it's not about your size, it's about how big your heart is, and you stuck it out. And you know what I mean? Like my feet didn't touch the ground the whole walk home. Fast forward to having 2 sons of my own. The older one loved football. The very first water break of his first practice when he was like 8 years old, he goes, "Dad, I love this." And he played right through high school. His younger brother was the smallest kid on his team. And the first week or so, He wasn't figuring it out. He wasn't getting it. He was ready to just quit. Something clicked inside. He was tackling kids twice his size. The coaches love him. Sometimes they put him at nose tackle, and found he was too small to block. He had a blast doing it all the way up to like 8th grade or whatever. It was a pure positive for all three of us. That's the experience that you're never going to allow your kid if you're so worried about them getting hit, getting injured, even just getting bumped around a little bit. You're eliminating that possibility from them. And any parent that's saying, well, that's dangerous, so yes, stay inside and pick up a game controller and play NBA 2K is doing the kid a disservice.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the USAID stuff in the news right now, there's like $32,000 for transgender comic book that we're promoting in Peru. It's written here. There's all kinds of ways that there's been kind of the underlying political wind towards, say, things that favor transgenderism and, kind of sexual blur and whatnot. And it goes throughout the society. If you watch the, last bunch of Oscars and so forth, they're mostly movies I have no interest in looking at and haven't and whatnot. So there's kind of like this societal mix down. There's also that thing I only heard about recently. It was called, I think, Gamestergate or Gamergate from about 10 years ago, where people were protesting that kind of like what happened to Disney for the Marvel comics, that, the games where guys keep looking for this refuge where they can do the stuff that guys like to do, which is, kind of be king of the hill. Girls have a kind of a different ethos for, play. Their typical one is like having a party with tea and whatnot, getting together and conversing. And boys want to figure out who's the best and strongest and be, supreme. And that plays out, diplomacy and a lot of other things. But football and the reason, I watch a fair amount of sports, I tape them, so I kind of watch them condensed and whatnot. But there's a genuine thrill because you don't know the answer. And it's all played out in their faces, their expressions, and how well they can kind of draw upon their inner strength. And not everybody has it. Some guys have the physique and they can't make it. They can't cut it. And so there's kind of a mental economy that we look at to see how we can model our own behaviors. I forget what his name. I think it was Darius Miles or something like that. It was a while ago. He was a top draft pick. I apologize for getting his name wrong. And I don't know, Seattle or somebody picked him up. Or you can think of Sean Kemp or whatever. Guys that are physical beasts and whatnot. And they should have incredible careers, and some of them do, and some of them get veer off. They can't maintain the discipline. And so on a certain level, there's this discipline, this applied discipline. Nobody likes bullying. I have a brother who's like an Irish twin. No offense to you guys, and he was brutal to me. He's older, and then he took up wrestling one year, and he hit puberty obviously before I did, and that was the worst year of my life. But what did I do? I mean, it's like he was kind of quasi, not real, but sort of torturing me every day. I took up wrestling, next year, and then I had to get good enough at it, being smaller than he, to kind of make a deterrence out of it. And these are huge lessons, and it's like, wrestling is a similar sport where you can be any particular size and still prosper. The NFL, football in general, has this way of, finding your niche and finding, Danny Woodhead made a career, like 5'3" or something like that. You can find a place in a lot of these sports, and you can't do it in some others. Sorry about all that, but, I don't know where we go from that one, but, what do you think, I guess, societally, it would be the question. You're kind of an observer of social mores and whatnot. You actually both are, but, how much do you think the war on football is about the actual concussions, or how much do you think it's fighting by other means to kind of bring down, John Wayne, kind of the American cowboy, et cetera, all that's, good and male and so forth, male toxic masculinity?
I think the war on football is a cultural tick masquerading as a public health crusade. And that's, if you look at bullying or any of these other causes, any of these other sort of pet causes that come along every few years, usually the fault lines in our society, a lot of them are not even political or ideological. I just think they're cultural ticks. I didn't like these guys in high school, so this is bad. And so I think that's what the war on football is, because if people were really concerned with health, they would want to get these kids active by any means necessary. And it's not to say you can't get hurt in football, and it's not to say that people haven't had real big injuries in football, but everything in life worth doing takes risk. Even walking outside, there's a certain element of risk. Skateboarding is something there's no war on skateboarding. No one's saying we should ban skateboarding, but obviously many more people die skateboarding or bicycling or sailing or skiing every year than they do playing football. But it's football, the one that was under attack so long. And to a certain degree, it still is under attack. So I think the key in looking at this issue is that it's a cultural tick masquerading as a public health crusade.
Yeah, I believe it was, if I've got the number right, RFK Jr. said 60% of Americans youth aren't eligible for the military. By the way, there was a disease he came down with, so I shouldn't talk like that. But I think he would be cool with it. And yeah, I think to Dan's point, there is a general pushback against masculinity. That I think is undeniable, and I think the pendulum swung as far as it's going to, and I like to think it's coming back. But yeah, when you've got a soft, doughy population, and I don't know if you guys will get the reference, but look like the people on the spaceship in the movie WALL-E, with just these carbon blobs with like no skeleton underneath them or whatever, then the last thing you should be angry about is boys doing active things. I coached both of my sons' teams over the span of 11 years in total. Not once on it. And by the way, I was just like the assistant on the JV defense. Like, I was the guy who walked around practice doing Simpsons impressions and maybe showing what a 3-point stance is. I wasn't like a hero the way, like, say, a Tim Walsh is. But at no point did we ever say, okay, guys, we're going to do a hitting drill where every kid didn't go, yes. What they didn't want was to stand there and be lectured to about like reads and zones and whatever. We had a coach on another level who did that. And by the time these kids went to high school, there were 4 still playing football because he bored them to death every day. Every time we said, let's hit, these kids were like lion cubs on the savannah. Like they want to play, they want to jump and pounce on each other and roll around. And when you deny that to a boy, then you're stunting his growth, physical, emotional, his confidence, his well-being is all wrapped up in him being allowed to be a boy. And if we're ever to lose that, then the rest of society is just going to crumble around us.
Yeah, well, we've seen a fair amount of that. I coached soccer for my younger son, maybe 7 or 8 years, but all year long because we had winter soccer, indoors and so forth. And I played some soccer, but I was not that great, and so I knew the basics and whatnot. By the way, don't use your hands. My coaching style was to win. And I had these kids, we kind of rushed I had some of my defenders kind of come up. There was some risky stuff. We would kind of load the zone and whatnot. And every now and then we got punished, but a lot of times we just scored a lot. And we had this kind of concept of winning and enjoying winning. And the other teams, I assume they like winning, but it was really, to use Adam Carolla's term, is kind of pussified in the sense that, you kind of had to have all the players kind of play the same amount and they had to play different positions. It was all this kind of equity aspect to it. And the kids get a sense of like what's what and who's who and where people should be. And I think even though they're small, they have, kind of, they're not quite adult brains, but they have motivations that are not that dissimilar. They're almost like humans and they liked it, they liked winning. And we had like a, good esprit de corps, and we kind of outplayed our talent level. I wasn't, my kid, wherever my kid, what grade it is the team I had. So sometimes it was a higher team, but sometimes like 5 or 6, the 6th best team, whatever. And a lot of times we play up, it's like, it depended. But uniformly, the kids like that. They buy into this. And one time, by the way, just we were challenged by the same age girls team. I think they were like 11 years old at the time. And this was the best girls team in the city. And they're like, oh, we can beat you boys because you boys, blah, blah, blah. And the boys were really up to this. We had we were like the 5th level boys. So we weren't the top level boys team. And it wasn't even close. My guys just like, they were so amped for this thing. The girls had brought cookies, and they had their faces painted with flowers and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they were having a good time. But once, literally push came to shove, there was not much of a battle there. And afterwards, the girls' coach, was told me that, oh, they could do it. They could beat them 3 times later and all this kind of stuff. But the boys, they took it as a challenge, and they would have had a big loss, literally kind of like emotionally losing, and they couldn't. And it was I'm not sure it was a big moment for them, but they acted that way at the time. And I think there's something that, I don't know how it would change their lives, et cetera, but it's something that guys have to do. They need the heroic arc, and they need to follow it. So just kind of curious, Dan, what kind of reception did you get for the book? And do you find it kind of ticks up during football season or Super Bowl and whatnot?
Well, I think one of the healthy reactions to it, and it's a delayed reaction, is that I don't think that the monomania for ending the game or, acting as though it's a public health nuisance, that's not as prevalent as it was when the book came out. I think the book came out in 2013 or something like that. And that was kind of the height of all that. I think the thing I learned from writing the book is that people want to watch football more than they want to read about it. That was kind of bad for sales. I mean, people did buy it. And, ESPN finally had me on really late in the game, like after the book had been out for a while. And I think I did really well on the Outside the Lines program in a debate format. I think I did so well they didn't have me back, if you know what I'm saying. But there was so much flooding the zone at the time that football is bad, football is dangerous, that people almost looked upon the statistics that I would use as kind of like conspiracy theory stuff. To give you an example, there was a study over 10 years in the 1940s and 50s of players at Minnesota high schools, and they compared those players, their rates of neurodegenerative disease, things like ALS and Alzheimer's, with that of people who were part of the glee club, choir, and the band. And they found that for 2 of the 3 neurodegenerative diseases that they looked at, there were actually elevated rates vis-a-vis the football players in the musically oriented kids. And in one of them, it was almost statistically insignificant. It was statistically insignificant. And I think it was a little bit bigger for football. But when you say that, you say, well, the Mayo Clinic did this study. People act like, you have a tinfoil hat. Like, doesn't the Mayo Clinic kind of absolve you from all that, immunize it from those kind of strange looks? Doesn't the fact that the federal government, NIOSH, did this study of the mortality rates of football, doesn't that give you a kind of credibility? I would have thought, but I don't think it was that way. I just think people were so absorbed. It didn't matter what their political bent was. They were so, almost by osmosis, they had taken in this this cultural crusade and internalized it all. And so I do think that I had a very difficult time kind of convincing people that, I was merely putting forward statistics, merely putting forward data, and that the data, clashed in a really dramatic way with what was being said by, massive figures of import, opinion makers and that kind of thing. I really was running against the wind on that one. And I think the sales kind of showed that it wasn't the most successful book I wrote by any means. I thought it was a book that I thought was going to be a lot more successful than it was. I mean, it had some success. I don't want to downplay it, but I think ultimately with football, like I said, people like to watch it more than they like to read about it. From what I can understand, there's a million great baseball books. There's a million great golf books. I think there's one great football book, which is A Fan's Notes by Frederick Exley. I mean, that's the only great football book that I know of. And so I just think the main problem is that people would rather watch it on Sunday than read about it when they're going to bed.
So our other great football writer, Jerry, what do you think about that?
I think there's a couple of great football books. From Darkness to Dynasty, the first 40 years of the New England Patriots, I can recommend that. And 6 Rings about the Patriots championship series, written by, incredibly handsome and gifted author. No, I think this. Look, when when there was this pushback against the very nature of football in and of itself, like, and that was really in the discussion like 10 years ago. It was almost commonly accepted that we're seeing the death throes of pro football in America, college football, whatever. It's ignoring a very salient point. A while ago, I was in Arizona and went through these ancient Native American village. I forget what it was. It's a national park, whatever, beautiful place. There was a pit there where they played an ancient game, kind of like lacrosse, the way it was described. There was a net at each end. It was this round stone structure. The point being that since the dawn of civilization, the one through line that's consistently happened is that people want to sit in a circle and watch men fight. A lot of people find that unpleasant. There's a lot of people that want to take the fighting out of hockey. I have friends who claim to be very big hockey fans but can't stand the fighting. Okay, then you're just denying our nature, whether it was with sticks and balls in Arizona, or if it was with swords in Rome, or jousting poles, or bare knuckles, or boxing gloves, or now football helmets. It's what we do. And football just happens to be the modern version of it, which has been sanitized and made safe, and it should be. If you're coaching youth football, for the love of God in heaven, teach kids how to tackle right so that they don't go in lead with their helmets. That's your responsibility once you fill out that Corey form and volunteer to teach kids the game. Put your head off to the side. Protect yourself by dishing out a hit. Don't absorb a hit. All these fundamental things. And that's how you keep the controlled violence that is football relevant, and you keep it a part of our culture, and hopefully it'll be here to stay. And right now I don't see it going anywhere, but it wasn't that long ago the people were talking about we're seeing it gone for good. And hopefully the youth that you were talking about, the youth game, Dan, is going to pick back up, because I pity the idea of a country where we don't let our kids grow up and be tough and learn about teamwork and all those altruistic things that sound like nonsense, but I've witnessed it by coaching kids on a youth level.
Yeah. By virtue of this thing called the internet, I see things that I never thought I'd see. And I see these guys jumping off cliffs with these little, flying squirrel outfits. And the guy's wearing a helmet, bravo, it's you're going to be just as much a quadriplegic, if you hit the wrong way or if you live. And so people do stuff. They like that. They want to crease the sky, kind of Icarus, daring and whatnot. And, I think there's actually studies shown that, the more safety equipment we put on doesn't really change the level of injuries that kids, mostly boys and young men, will garner. I think there's one about, snowboarding, where they have more helmets, arm guards, elbow guards, whatnot, just as many injuries. Every time they add another layer of safety, they do more stuff, because you see these, again, these little Instagram reels, whatever, guys are on these tiny little razor skateboards, and they're going down, like a ski jump, and then they do double flips, and they just happen to land. And this parkour, there's no safety net for a lot of these things. These guys don't, and, there's rock climbing, REI, people are just kind of doing this stuff because that is like, the essence of being alive. Getting back to our little friend COVID there, one of the things that was most infuriating was the presumption that everyone was your granny, that you were your granny. And it's like, we literally had my 92-year-old, now deceased, may she rest in peace, mother-in-law in the basement. She didn't pass from COVID, but everybody's supposed to be like her. No, you have your lives to lead, and it has some attendant risk. People have a hard time with facts and with data, and they just kind of go with emotions. And I think they've kind of flown through that. So we're rounding out the hour a little bit. Dan, do you want to give us your predictions for the game, then followed by Jerry, or do you want to kind of have any other thoughts about this topic?
Well, it's tough. I put my prediction on. I have a newsletter called Spectator AM that's affiliated with the American Spectator. I have a pretty lively audience of people that read that. And I just sort of threw it out there. Hey, who do you want? I noticed ESPN, their experts, I think by almost 2-1, they predicted the Chiefs, which, that is obviously, you can't go wrong with the Chiefs. I mean, it's a quarterback game. Mahomes is the best in the game. So that's not a bad pick. The Chiefs to me this year, they've been the least impressive 15-2 two-loss football team that I've ever seen. I mean, there were a lot of close games there. The Eagles, on the other hand, they have this kind of football that's a bit of a throwback. If you look at their line, that's scary. They have a scary offensive line. And Saquon Barkley, I mean, he's a great running back, not taking anything away from him. But boy, he's got these beasts in front of him, these offensive linemen, these hogs for the Eagles. So I predicted, I took the points in the Eagles, and I think that, it's, I guess the point total is 49. I think it's probably going to go over because that's what happens in Super Bowl. So I think I'd take the Eagles with the points, and I'd say it's going to go over. That's my prediction.
And a wise one.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I'm rooting for, which is an asteroid to come and just wipe out the planet. So that I neither have to live in a world where the Chiefs have won 3 straight or the Eagles have won another in the span of 6 years. But the odds of that are slim. I like to think that Philly is a big, strong, as you mentioned, ball control team. Saquon Barkley is 30 yards away from the most rushing yards in an NFL season, regular and playoffs combined in history. And he's averaged 47 yards. Like those minimum carries, yards gained this year was 47. So seems likely that that's going to fall. I like to think he's going to get a couple of touchdowns and spare us from another Chiefs celebration. I also think that this is going to factor into it. The NFL has to be petrified right now about the obvious and blatant favoritism towards the Chiefs. If Patrick Mahomes throws an interception and it gets called back because of some phony baloney roughing call because, a defensive lineman looked at him sideways or had impure thoughts about him or whatever, it's going to bring the whole house of cards down. So I think they have to over officiate in favor of Philly. Terrell Owens, who's in the Hall of Fame, an all-decade team member, recently said, of course it's blatant that they're favoring Kansas City. My eyes aren't lying to me. I'm like, thank you. That will hopefully put this game on an even level. But it's the lesser of two evils. It's, would you rather be kneed in the groin or have your foot stomped on? Right now, I'll just take the foot stomp that will be watching Eagles fans, who are among the worst people in America.
Yeah, I don't have any predictions, but I think the referees should change their union to just Mahomies.
It's so good. I've got a prop bets going for my guests. Like, I'm just going to pull these out at random, but it's going to be, when is the first unnecessary roughness call that's going to favor the Chiefs? When are they first going to do the cutaway shot to Taylor Swift? How many times are they going to reference Travis Kelce, all this stuff? Because I'm just so beyond sick of them and the whole Jake from State Farm. And I love Andy Reid, but they've made me hate him with his like Fumblerooski, Bundlerooski. Like, he's not funny. Stop. Just make them go away, Philly. America is counting on you. America turns its lonely eyes to you, Eagles.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. I really appreciate this. One little last self-promotion, nothing to do with football. This is my book. You can buy it. You listeners, viewers out there, it's called Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. It's even better if you read it. And I have to say, for my reading, literally, no joke, the last 2 books I reread Dan Flynn's The War on Football, so I recommend buying it. You can't have my copy, but maybe I'll get him to sign one. And Six Rings. It's on my Kindle. And if you go back on this film, you'll see that I purchased both those so I can prove it. So I hope that Andy Reid and or Patrick Mahomes don't catch up to Six Rings, but things kind of look bleak. And the greatest dynasty, it's going to be a tough one. So just kind of last words, Jerry. So let's say that the inevitable, maybe, I don't know, happens, and Patrick Mahomes is the greatest quarterback ever. Andy Reid is the greatest coach ever. Can we utter those words? Will you have those thoughts cross your mind if the numbers kind of dictate?
It was 19 seasons between the Patriots' first Super Bowl and their last Super Bowl. Let's see Kansas City get within a million parsecs of that. How many astronomical units separate these teams at the moment? Kansas City's on an unbelievable run. There's no question about it. Do 6 over the span of 19 years, and then we'll have a conversation. Right now, we're not there yet.
All right, I'm going to have to set my watch. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate it. We're going to hang around just for a second, but that's all for our audience. Come back soon and follow these guys. Jerry, I didn't put up their Twitters, but Jerry Thornton, I think Jerry Thornton #1. I'm not sure about Dan. Are you on any social medias?
I'm not. I'm thinking maybe I made the bad decision to not go on them. I just thought for a long time they were for morons or something. But it's kind of like the guy who said, automobiles are, not the wave of the future. It's the horse and buggy. So I'm sort of at that horse and buggy stage. I probably need to change very quickly. So no social media.
Yeah, Paul Krugman, I don't know if he got the Nobel Prize, but he said the internet is going to be like the fax machine or something like that. Anyway, come and go.
Good call.